All right. As you mentioned, I'm just going to ask the question: who in here likes
if I
swords?
get in your way.
Who in here likes physics?
Okay.
All right, you're in the right room. If you didn't raise your hands on both those things, I'm sorry. Doors are closed. You're stuck.
You also might like physics by the end of this because they make swords work.
Fun. Real quick introduction. My name is Thomas Riley. I am a historical weapons collector. I do historical European martial arts. I'm an instructor of HEMA, that's sword fighting. And I run a YouTube channel called Medieval Review. Go check it out if you ever want to see some interesting things that are kind of along this line, as well as many other things. With me is...
Hi, I'm Matt Biondi. I am a sword collector hopeful, I guess. I have nowhere near the collection that he has, but I'm starting to build up my own. I'm also a bowhurt fighter, which is the steel fighting stuff. If you guys were at the tournament yesterday, that was actually my first full-on fight in steel, so woohoo. Yeah.
And I believe Josh is up here just to help us because he's standing up here. But go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Josh Waters. I'm a sword collector and amateur historian and bowhurt fighter as well.
By our powers combined, we filled up this wall with medieval swords. It's pretty awesome. All right, we're going to be talking about physics a lot here, but we're also going to be talking about swords. And in talking about swords, we need to understand the basic components of a sword. This is kind of a crash course, so I'm not going to assume that everyone knows all this. I'm going to be focusing on European swords. This can apply to Japanese swords. It can apply to any sword object. It can actually apply to any melee hand weapon of any kind. But we're doing European swords for two reasons. One is the materials and the methods for making these swords matter a lot. And a lot of these things work really only truly, apparently, in European swords. And the other reason is that this concept came out of research being done by people within the larger European sword enthusiast community. That includes makers and practitioners such as myself, although I am not the inventor of this. I'm going to be a parrot, and I want to be really clear about that. Parts of the sword that we're going to care about, you got one in your hands, you can show it. You have the blade. Ooh, in the European sword, you have a crossguard, also sometimes called a quillin. You have the grip, with which you grip. You have the pommel, which is used as potentially a counterweight, also as something that you can hit people with. Hence, maybe the term pummeling someone. Don't know if that's actually really true, but everyone says it, so we'll just say it's true. You also have down the center, anyone want to take a guess at what this is down the part of the blade right there in the middle?
Not a blood groove.
Yes!
Not
Two in a row.
blood groove.
We are. I know, but shh, let's have our high. It's not a blood groove. You ever hear blood groove? That's a misconception. Some people say it's to when you stab someone, blood pours down it and it reduces suction. And no, it is in there for two reasons. One is it allows the blade to be bigger while maintaining the same weight, same mass. So it's a way of distributing mass. And fantastically enough, it actually helps to add some rigidity to the blade and actually helps it be more supportive. The way I put it is it's actually kind of equivalent to like an I-beam. So it actually gives some structural qualities to the blade itself. We won't talk about the other pieces, but generally speaking, we're going to be talking a lot about blades and hilts and the proportions of those pieces and how they can change. So, what are sword dynamics? I have a big old definition up here with a lot of things. Here's what it really comes down to. Sword dynamics is speaking to the functional agility of a sword, how well it handles. Who in here has actually handled real swords as any type of practitioner? So a couple of you. I remember you were in my practice group, and I think you were over there in practice group as well. Real swords are a little bit different from fake swords, and that matters. Materials, build quality, it all matters. But anyone who's ever used a sword understands one of two things. A sword is either a natural extension of the arm, or it is a glorified paperweight. There are some reasons why you might have a glorified paperweight. A good example of this would be what bowhurt guys do. They need things that will stand up to a pounding, so they actually overbuild their swords a bit. There's a reason for that. One is they want to really rock their opponent, but the other one is if you use a standard sword, it won't hold up to the abuse quite like they use it. And fair enough. They have a reason for that. But they still keep some of these concepts in mind. The smiths who make these swords keep these in mind. And a lot of this is going to be scientific. It's going to be physics-based. I hope to make it fun as much as physics can be fun. I am not Neil deGrasse Tyson, so you're not going to be like, oh man, that was really deep. But I hope it will be fun. And I hope that what you end up getting out of this is that what we are talking about here scientifically is something that swordsmiths across the globe innately understand. They have made these things like this, and they did not have the luxury of having a sword dynamics talk or these concepts at their disposal. It takes into account, more than anything, the proportions and distributions of mass. This is based on research that was done by a gentleman named Vincent Le Chevalier. He is an engineer. He's also a practitioner and enthusiast. Really smart guy. I've had a chance to work with him and talk with him. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this presentation. I'm one of the few people who's actually very close to this, even though I am not the inventor. He is, for all intents and purposes, the inventor. He took the concept of rod physics, which is a really basic idea of physics and distribution of mass, and he applied it to melee weapons. In order to do this research, he used a lot of information and data from a gentleman named Peter Johnson. Peter Johnson is a world-renowned swordsmith. He makes some of the best swords ever in terms of European swords. He knows his stuff, and if you ask a swordsmith if they know who Peter Johnson is, they will say yes. He is the swordsmith who teaches swordsmiths things they don't know. In terms of research, he gathers a lot of data. He goes to museum originals, he does measurements, and he helped gather data for this. All of this work is theirs. They own it. I'm trying to shine a light on it. Any mistakes I make in this, any mistakes that my friend Matt here makes in this, that's on us, not on them. They are infallible. They are amazing. They have done everything right, and if we do anything wrong, it's our fault. Sorry. The big deal here, and why this is really important for people like me who are practitioners and sword collectors, is that this becomes a shorthand for how swords perform. One of the biggest problems is you go on the internet and you go look up swords, like, look at all these swords, I want all of them, I wonder how they work, I can't really tell, all they tell me is how much they weigh, and maybe where the center of gravity is, and that's not, I can kind of guess what that might mean, but I don't really know how it will feel in the hand. This will help create a shorthand. For someone like me, I have 50 unique pieces of medieval swords in my collection, and each one handles differently. And if I were to go and apply this method to all of them, and then I were to go find another one that I want to buy, and they had this concept applied to it, I could match them up to something I already have in my collection and say, oh, it's very similar to that one. It's a shorthand. It's really nice, it's really cool, and it makes really awesome pictures. This is the website on which all this work was published. This is Vincent Le Chevalier's website. I highly suggest you go to it, Ensis Sub Kalo. He includes a calculator tool that allows you to basically get the data that we'll talk about gathering in this talk, and you can enter it in, and it builds this nice, pretty graph for you. Not quite as pretty as what I'm going to be presenting here, because there's a lot of work done after the fact, but it will show you the dynamic properties of a sword. And again, this can apply to a katana just as much as it can apply to a European longsword. This is what it looks like. Anyone want to hazard a guess what any of this means yet? Because it's really confusing. Some of it's going to be intuitive, some of it's not. We're actually going to break this down. We're going to talk about the pieces of it. But I can look at this, knowing what I now know about it, and hopefully by the end of this you will have at least an idea. I can look at this and say, I understand how this European arming sword is going to handle in my hands. I know how it's going to work. I know what it will be good for. It can be applied to any type of weapon, like I said. You can see it doesn't always look the same. There's varying levels of proportionality for all sorts of items. We'll get into this much deeper, and we'll kind of revisit this near the end so you can have an idea. By the way, FYI, Matt here is the resident physicist, so he's going to interject on things that he feels like I've done wrong because I'm not a physicist. So I'm going to talk a bit about the parts in general, and then we're going to go dig deep. The oval represents, I'm going to grab this sword for this. The oval represents my ability to move this in a transverse direction. That is, up, down, left, right. So, this weighs a certain amount. If I were to draw this in an oval, this feels fairly easy but still kind of heavy to do this with, so it's probably a slightly smaller oval. The cone shape represents this, angular movement, rotational movement. This is a long sword. It's meant to be used with 2 hands. This is really quick. I do that really fast. It does not take a lot of effort to move this sword. So the cone on this would probably be pretty big. Slightly smaller oval, probably large cone. You'll see some long swords in this presentation as we go, so keep that in mind. I'll point it out when we get to it. The red lines represent concepts of pivot points. So if I take a sword and I kind of do this with it, and wow, that's terrible. Let me try that again. I do kind of this with it. You can see that it pivots around a certain point that doesn't really move. Likewise, if I do this up here, it pivots slightly further up the blade. That's what those red lines represent. They matter for building the graphs, the nice cones and ovals. This little star pattern, asterisk pattern, also what I like to call the comical drawing of a cat's butt. That represents a center of balance, center of mass. Everyone who's ever handled a sword has probably done this with it. This is the shorthand we have used for years as sword collectors. Where is the center of mass? It's helpful, but it's not a great indicator of the dynamic properties of a sword. The blue represents what's called vibration nodes, and we're going to break this down, but that's basically if I hit this sword, there's places it vibrates. All right. The last thing is this little curve here represents the effective mass, and we'll talk about that.
One quick thing.
Go ahead.
Particularly those points are where it doesn't vibrate. So you'll see the whole thing shaking, then you'll see 2 points that don't move at all. That's what those are marking.
Yep. So here's the information that you need to gather to input to this calculator to get closer to building one of those graphs. The graphs don't look quite that pretty. You have to do a lot of work after the fact, but this is what you'd have to get. Mass, overall weight, usually in grams. Hilt extremity, that is where it begins. This is 0.0. Everything from here to the tip, usually done in centimeters or millimeters. Blade extremity, so that's the tip. Grip reference is where you would grip the sword. So on a long sword, I'd grip it with my hand right about there. Center of gravity, we already talked about, is where I balance it at. Lever reference, that's where my pinky would go with my second hand in the case of a long sword. So that's the lever reference. On an arming sword, the lever reference is done with the same hand as the grip reference, sorry. So it's kind of the one and the same. The hilt node and the blade node, that's where you hit it and it vibrates and you figure out where those things are. And then you have action points and pivot points. Action is up here, pivot is down here. All right. So, effective mass. Here's what effective mass means. This sword weighs 1,400 grams approximately, 1.4 kilograms. Okay, that's 2.8 pounds. I just try to do math. Don't try to do it. It hurts. It doesn't. Yeah, 2.9. Okay. It doesn't weigh that much. Swords are actually pretty light. But effective mass right here means that in order to move this blade up, kind of at all, I have to put that 2.9 pounds up. That's the mass or force against that mass I have to apply. I have to displace that. However, to displace the effective mass down here is like, oh, that's easy. We know this because it's just lever, right? It's leverage.
To interject real quick there, to get sort of a grounding for that, think of a door, and that point is your hinge, effectively. When you push really close to the hinge on a door, not really very easy to open. You kind of push against it. But if you go out to the edge, it swings right open, right? So you can kind of think of it in terms of that.
Yep. What this also means for the use of this object to kill someone is that you are transferring that effective mass to your opponent. So when you strike at an opponent, which I'm going to now kill our resident physicist, you can thank me later. When I strike, I want to hit in the part of the blade that's going to be effective, the most effective. And that's taking a lot of things into account. But wherever that is, it's going to not be with the full mass of the sword in terms of adding in all the velocity and all that type of stuff, inertia and all that. But I want to find that spot. And that amount of mass is going to be part of what transfers to his body, i.e. cuts into him. So swords that have a really, really rapid curve like you see with this rapier, they're not real great at cutting. We know this from rapiers, because what do rapiers do? Yeah, they stabby, right? no one's cutting things with that. I mean, you can, don't get me wrong, you can, but it's not as effective. Whereas the falchion here, which we have one on the wall there, is really good at cutting, and it's because that effective mass where you're going to basically strike with that blade is much higher. It's designed for that. Again, this is something the creators innately knew, and we're just discovering with physics. And then I have an approximation of a long sword here, and it's kind of somewhere in between, right? Halfway decent at cutting, but not necessarily nearly as good as the falchion. Likewise, you can see some variations in terms of the cones and ovals in terms of agility. So, interestingly enough, a rapier, because you don't need to cut, you don't need that high agility. And in fact, you want it to not be super agile this way, because if it's super agile this way, it also means your opponent can displace it really easily. Just pop, oh, that's out of the way. But when it's sitting here, they hit it, it just kind of goes whoop and moves around. It takes a lot to overcome them keeping it, your opponent or you keeping the blade out in front of you. However, something like a long sword, you can see this is actually pretty typical of a long sword, even like this one. It's super mobile, super agile, but at the same time, it doesn't take a lot to displace it. This is something that practitioners call the weak of the sword. They know innately that it's very easy to move a sword, a long sword, just by putting some lever against the tip.
And that has to do again with the same, you can think about it the same way with the door. If you push on the end, it's very easy to move it. That's the end of the door.
Yep. So this is not just about how well this handles, it's also about how it is effective for your opponent to go against your sword. So you can think of it in those two ways. The rapier is the best example of that. You want a rapier that's actually kind of small in these things. It means you have really good point control. Pivot points. So we talked a bit about it, how you find it. This is unscientifically and scientifically called the waggle test for a good reason, right? And I'm not doing it real well here, but that's all right. You try to grip as lightly as possible on the reference point for the grip. This is where my fingers would normally be. In a long sword, you're about a centimeter back from the cross. You never grip right up on. And you just kind of do this back and forth as lightly gripping as you can, and it just kind of naturally makes a little line. In fact, would you please draw, not on this one, let's do it with this one.
Yeah.
We won't do it with a really nice sword. So I'm going to take this sword, and I'm just going to kind of do this, and where do you think it is? Okay, so do it again.
It's pretty close.
Pretty close. All right, now we do another one up here. All right, so we've found our two reference points here, right? Based on the design of the sword, how the blade is implemented, these things can vary a lot. It also matters how the hilt is made. We'll get to that in a moment. I'll show you an example of what that looks like, because a sword blade by itself acts one way. You add all of these hilt furniture pieces, it acts completely different. Anyone here interested in bladesmithing or would ever like to make swords? Keep this in mind. Knives, not so much, but if you're making a sword, it really matters what you do with this stuff. If you think, man, this sword performs really poorly, maybe go check out Sword Dynamics. Figure out if you maybe need to add weight or reduce weight in your pommel or in your crossguard.
And if you happen to own a sword whose pommel can come off, swing it around a little bit with the pommel, take the pommel off, and see if you can do anything close to the same.
Yep.
Be careful with that, though, because if you take the pommel off, you can...
If it's blunt, it's better.
Yeah.
Said someone in Oregon. So in general, though, this all matters when you're making a sword. And again, people innately knew this. In terms of vibration nodes, we're going to find it here. Do the red marker. Maybe they'll show up. Okay. And this is a long sword, so what's going to actually happen here, I'm going to kind of grip it. It's actually not super sharp, but it's likely going to be right about here.
Yeah.
You can't see it as easily. I think it's right about there.
Yeah,
So we're going to call it right about underneath this middle riser on the grip. Okay? What this means is, and long swords aren't nearly as good as arming swords to demonstrate this. Here's going to be my indicator for the value of a vibration node. We end up with something to hit.
Would block, you mean?
Here, let's use a shield.
Sure.
I think I was using a shield, right? Alright. So I'm just going to tap, and when I hit here, I feel the vibrations in my hand. Anyone play baseball?
Mm-hmm.
You ever hit the ball really hard and your hand hurts for like 3 days? That's why. Because you didn't hit in the right part of the bat. If I move up this, you can actually hear the difference. A little bit of ringing. me actually turn it around. Watch where the vibration node is.
Oh.
They're roughly equivalent. What I just did was I found what's called the center of percussion. There's mathematical formulas for finding that. There's also really cheap ways of finding that. They are not the same as the vibration node. But a good sword, they'll be really close. Here's why. Because when I hit someone with this, I want to hit with that center of percussion. That's where I transfer the most amount of mass into my opponent. Likewise, it's where I feel it the least in my hands. So it's the most efficient use of that momentum and that energy. In an arming sword, that vibration node is going to be right about here where these three fingers, your thumb and your two fingers, are going to grip. You want to smack that on its, so vibration node is right about where? Right about there. Oh, it's about where I'd expect it to be. And where does it seem to be in your hand?
Right about where you said.
Yep. And that's going to be true of any really well-made sword. If you are doing these tests and you hit that thing and it vibrates here and it's all nice, but then it's vibrating like back here, this is where it cancels out, you need to rethink the sword. It may not be as good as you might think. This is what it looks like if before and after hilt furniture. You can see it does some funky things to these kind of components, these things we're looking at. So the pivot points are the same where the grip reference is, but you can see they change based on whether or not there's hilt components on there. Likewise, vibration nodes don't really change all that much in the blade, but in the grip they might change a bit. It also moves things around in odd ways. Some things expand out, some things contract in. It's an interesting feature of swords. It's just, again, how you're distributing the mass. And by distributing mass, if you add mass to one end, you have now added mass and redistributed it.
To jump in there real quick, we can sort of, because I'm the physicist, you relate this back to rod physics, and particularly the idea of the moment of inertia, which is a fancy $5 way of saying how hard it is to get something to move. It deals a lot with the center of mass, and if you move that center of mass by adding weight to one end or another, what's going to happen is, particularly, let's say that without all of this, the center of mass is like way out here, right? It's going to take a lot more force for me to get this sword to move than it would be if the center of mass was closer to my hand, because there's more distance, and that means that there is more weight between my hand and the center of mass.
For a long time, center of mass was always said to be like between 4 and 6 inches, whether it was an army sword or a long sword. Army swords tended to be closer to 6 inches, long swords tended to be closer to that 4 mark. And we'd be like, oh, if it's not between that kind of magic number, it's not a good sword. That was the only shorthand we had. What we didn't know really at the time is that also the closer that goes to that the grip, to the hilt, the less effective the cut would be as well. All the way near the leather piece, yeah.
Okay.
Not a great center of balance. That's a center of balance stand, and it's not the greatest sword. So it matters for understanding how this stuff applies. So who in here likes video games? Who in here is thinking about how do I apply this to video games? Because if you're like me and you like video games, you try to apply everything to video games. It's a really good question. I don't know. So much of sword fighting in video games are difficult, but I would like to see better physical modeling for these things, i.e. how much damage is being done. It would be really cool if in a video game you had to consider the distance to your opponent, not just whether or not they're in range for the little X bubble to appear above their head so you mash it real hard.
So I'll jump in there real quick too, because, and this is not a resident physicist thing, I also happen to own a small game company on the side. I'm a computer scientist and I program. So one example of a game that actually does that pretty well, Super Smash Bros. Melee. Anybody like the Marth Tipper? Yeah, so that kind of approximates the idea of getting that nice center of percussion way out here, because that tip of the sword does a lot more damage. But yeah, as far as game development goes, there are two aspects to it, I think. One is actually the animation. I find a lot of games, swords don't have good weight, and you know, your character just swinging around wildly and it looks like the sword weighs nothing, or they're swinging it like it feels like 20 pounds and it's... Right?
Dark Souls, anyone?
Yeah. Use the dragon tooth, see how that works out for you. But yeah, so in terms of animation, I think a lot can be done to make it feel like the character is swinging a weighted sword. And then, like you said, the mechanics and actually taking into account where in the sword a hit goes, and what kind of strike versus what kind of armor. There are certain games that do this well, especially certain games that deal with medieval combat in general. There are ones that do it better than others, etc. But it's an area that I think could use a lot more work, as you said.
For Honor is interesting because For Honor tries to reference some historical ideas, concepts, and they do it very ham-fistedly. Because they basically do it like you'd expect a AAA developer to do. They're like, ooh, there's this cool thing called a Mordhau. It's where I'm fighting with a sword and I decide, oh no, I'm going to have to really hit this guy, so I'm just going to come in and smack him. And that's a real thing. But the way they do it in the game is kind of like gimmicky and silly.
Did someone say, why would you do that?
Yes.
Club.
Club. Big club.
This is a club. You
Helmet.
It won't hurt at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I can do this all day.
Yeah, correct. Swords don't really do that. So as long as you're holding it, and there's certain ways to grip the sword, and certain ways you should and shouldn't, you can smack people upside the head all day long with it, and it will be fine. And this is a method that is used in historical manuals, called out specifically. It's called Mordhau. It means death strike or mortal strike, or however you want to translate it from the German. There's a game coming out called Mordhau that is named after this. It's kind of like Chivalry or Wars of the Roses, those type of games. There's also a game coming out called Kingdom Come Deliverance. That's the one all of us are looking forward to because it is actually really being very intelligent on how it applies concepts of medieval combat and trying to actually dispel some of the myths. And so when someone's wearing armor, you can come up with a sword and they're going to be like, all right, whatever. In that game, at least I hope. It's going to be really good. I'm really looking forward to it.
I can attest that. I was an alpha and beta tester for the game, too.
Oh, nice. Lucky.
Yeah, I kickstarted it because I was like, yes.
But we digress.
Yes, we digress. Look, we can talk about video games all day.
Oh, yeah.
We're on the
We
wrong
should
track
do a
for
panel
that.
on that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We're on the wrong track for that right now. All right. So putting all these things together a bit, you can kind of get a model like this. I've pointed out some of the reference pieces. Here's a different sword showing it. Here are all the different examples you can see. Look at this one. Look at how mobile this one is. That's a really, really light sword. If I remember correctly, it's 400. Oh, look, it's right there. 450 grams. You can. It feels like you can almost buy a box of paper clips that's heavier than this. But it's a super light sword. Likewise, you have swords that are extremely heavy and they don't work well. I actually don't have it. There's a really good, interesting one of what's called a Zweihander. Big, like 7-foot tall, two-handed swords. Ridiculous. They're heavy. They're only like 8 pounds, but it's pretty heavy. But the dynamics graph for that, like the sword is obscuring the actual dynamic properties. So, but they work. They work really well for their purposes. So why does all this matter? I couldn't sum it up any better than the person who invented this, the person who rediscovered this, Vincent Le Chevalier. To quote him, a sword made of soft iron but with good balance will be a superior weapon to one that is made of fine steel, of excellent temper, but that is sluggish and unresponsive. It doesn't matter how well made your sword is. If you as a practitioner, as you as a fighter, are going to be like coming at you Blood Souls or Dark Souls or Bloodborne style, rah, and he comes in with his light sword and he's just like, stab. All right. Yeah, I'm not really gonna win that. You want a responsive sword. Anybody who's ever used swords will tell you the best sword feels like an extension of the arm. You just use it and it feels natural. It's a very, very hard thing to articulate to people who've never used swords. So, I seem to recall asking who has used a sword before, and very few people raise their hand. Your homework assignment is to go find a place to go use swords. No. Make sure you're using the right type of sword, though. Don't go buy the cheap wall hanger decorative ones. They're available all over the place, but they're not what you want. You want a good sword. So if you're interested in sword collecting or things like that, begin to look for the good stuff, made of good materials, made properly, and hopefully, I know there's a couple companies that are actually beginning to use this shorthand. Kind of have to dig for it. They actually treat it like MSDS sheets for people who are buying chemicals. Like somewhere deep down you find it in their product description. But more and more people are beginning to think about how this applies, and it's great because manufacturers of these items are beginning to take things into account a bit more. Questions?
Well, on that note, real quick, before we take questions, if you are looking for good swords to start collecting at pretty reasonable prices, we do have Cult of Athena cards right at the door. Cult of Athena is excellent. A lot of the swords on this wall came from Cult of Athena or can be bought on Cult of Athena. Highly recommended.
Yes, and if you sort by battle ready, by the way, they're the only reseller that you can trust that term. If anyone tells you something battle ready and they aren't called Cult of Athena, don't trust them.
Yep. And in general, if you are looking
I know.
elsewhere,
Reseller.
Sorry, that's not 100% accurate. I'm sorry, I have
Yeah, I
to
know.
stop. There's a lot of Cult of Athena that says battle ready that is not. Even they aren't good at it.
Fair enough. But generally speaking, when that term comes up, it's more trustworthy.
Because we've had many
Yeah.
explode.
Yeah, fair enough. There is something called stage combat as well. Those are slightly more overbuilt because they take a lot of abuse. But they try to be very careful to actually separate them out into functional and non-functional. And by the way, with swords, you pay for what you get. Like the more expensive the sword, generally speaking, good rule of thumb. It's not always true. There's always the exception that proves the rule, right? But generally speaking, you're going to be paying more for a good sword. Yeah, it's not going to be $50. Sorry.
in general, a good idea. Don't get stainless steel unless you just want it to hang on a wall. And typically, you want to look for the words full tang as well. They're not always trustworthy, but if it's not that, it's not going to hold up very well.
And if you're ever not sure, dynamics are actually a really good way to find out whether it's got a full tang or not, because if the proportions are off with the tang, it will show. But we digress, right? And at the end of the day, this is all meant to act as a shorthand. It's this really kind of weird, very niche concept. I know some of you are like, I had no idea this is what we were going to be talking about. It's kind of weird. It's all right. For people like me, it's really interesting. It's really good. And I think there's a lot of interesting applications for this. But it is kind of a burgeoning concept. This was published about 2 years ago in that book, Sword, Form, and Thought. And it's only slowly getting out into the larger community. In fact, I think it was officially published as the tool available online only about April of this year. So this is really new stuff. All right, now, questions.
When you were talking about just feeling out swords for dynamics, I've got friends that fenced in college and high school. Are those worth just waving around? Like fencing swords, do they not apply at all?
Fencing swords are a little bit different because they're designed for a sport that really facilitates light, quick swords.
Okay.
And your agility graph for those things is going to be like off the charts.
Even with a saber?
Yeah, even with a saber. Because even their cutting isn't really designed to actually cut.
Okay.
It's designed to get in quickly and score the electronic point, right?
So if you recall the graph that was shown for the rapier, where the center of mass is like a big bump and then immediate drop off, they'd be even more extreme than that.
Okay.
Very similar. And their cone would be like just ginormous.
Yep.
You were saying about collecting swords, and you said not to look for stainless steel, but is there a specific type of material or a specific gauge of steel that you would recommend?
So typically the words high carbon are useful to look for, but there are a lot of different steels that fall under that umbrella. It's basically a whole topic to research on its own of what kinds of steel would be good. But
5160 is used a lot.
yeah.
The 1065 high carbon steel up through
95, I think.
95 would be really high. 95 tends to go in dagger range because that steel gets a lot more brittle in terms of the tempering process. I think 1075 is what Albion used to use. They now use something else. There are sword makers who are using Shock 7 tool steel now for things like faders, which are practice swords that take a lot of abuse. Steel is a complex thing, guys. I can't wrap my head around it sometimes, but generally speaking, you want a good high carbon steel. Spring steel as well works pretty well. It's kind of hard to really recommend a specific type.
A person who has a very in-depth to the point of I can't read it because it's too complex. Nadler, go to nadler.us. He has a whole breakdown of steel and how it works and everything. He's not talking. He's not recommending one thing over another. He just gives you all of the information, and it's a lot. It's a whole lot.
Is that still nadler.us or isn't it
Nadler.us is last idea.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Or just Google search it, maybe you'll
yeah,
find it.
Google search Craig Nadler.
And one thing on
Pretty
steel,
popular on the steel side.
yeah, one thing on steel just in general is a lot of the makers that are good, that you can find good reputations for, they tend to use one type of steel pretty consistently. So I know like Hanway uses 5160 a lot.
Yeah.
Some of their other sub groups and whatnot might use something else.
So, if you have to fight a single opponent, what sword do you take, assuming the opponent is unarmored and armored?
If they're armored,
Either or. Like, what do you take?
the
for an
sword will
armored
be on my
opponent?
side. I want something else if I'm playing someone in armor.
Okay.
Swords are sidearms. In the modern day equivalency, the sword is the pistol, and the assault rifle is a poleaxe or something like that. Because swords in and of themselves are not great against armor. And neither are katanas. Sorry, katanas don't cut through tanks or armor or anything. They will bounce off. It's not real effective. If I'm using a sword against a suit of armor, it's going to be a heavily tapered sword, like that one that's kind of right under that warhammer back there, or one similar. Because I want to be able to get into those crevices, into those points. The guys who do the fighting in armor, what's the one rule? Well, one of the major rules you guys have.
Trust the armor.
No thrusting.
No thrusting. Why is that the one rule?
Because it's what beats armor.
There you go. So I want a weapon that's good at thrusting. If I take a weapon that is more rounded at the tip, I'm not going to be getting into the armor as easily. So that's the answer for armor. For unarmored, I personally would use a longsword because I'm really good at longsword.
That's fair.
But my answer to that would be you use the tool that's right for you. Practitioners get really good at one type of weapon or not. They find things that work for them that may not work for other people. And it's just the nature of it, right? Some people like slightly longer blades. Some people like slightly shorter blades, a la the German fighters versus the Italian fighters, because there's blade lengths because they're different heights of people. There are things that you do that make the sword work. From a dynamics perspective, you look for things that work for you, and if you like super mobile, then you go super mobile. If you decide I'm going to be that one guy who's going to get that one really good hit in, you want that effective mass curve to be as high as possible. Falchions are really good, by the way, for unarmored individuals because they'll just cut through anything. But I also would want reach and all that because I want to outreach the person. And honestly, I would never use a sword for any of that if I had like a pole armor or a spear. I'd always default to that first. Other questions?
You mentioned the sword should be like an extension of the arm.
Mm-hmm.
Would the fighter affect that dynamic, so to speak? Like if you picked up a sword versus how he picked up a sword?
Yes, to some extent, especially where bad habits are formed. I would say that's very true. And it probably also matters for how much muscle mass you have, how much weight you can handle versus that wrist strength. Especially I think about someone who fights with like sabers or small swords. There's a lot of what's called a moulinet, and they just do this all the time, and their wrists, like if you had a weak wrist, you wouldn't want to do that, so there'd be dynamic properties. You know, if you're not going to do this a lot, they get a rapier, right? You stick it out there and you poke someone, and you try not to do a lot of that movement. The extension of the arm thing is more, I don't know how to say it, it's more of an intangible. You know it when you feel it, right? It's what works for you, and honestly, I don't know that there's been a lot of scientific studies of like different body types and how they apply, so I don't know that we have a scientific answer, but I would say each into their own until we have better evidence.
For the armored fighters who actively fight, there's a whole Jonathan here. We have the same manufacturer builds 3 swords, 3 different quality levels and 3 different balances in them. The highest end one, Jonathan loves. I love the mid-grade one. One of our other fighters loves the low-grade one. They're all just slightly different in how the whole dynamic is, but there's nothing but our own personal. We pick it up and we swing it like, oh, this feels good. And he's like, it feels like trash. You know,
And from a practitioner standpoint, how great would it be if you knew what the dynamic properties were of those 3 swords, and then someone said, hey, I'm selling these 100 swords, which one would you like? And you could say, well, I want that one because it's most similar to this thing I love.
Right.
Again, that's where this is powerful. It's that communication of the intangible that we can now make slightly more tangible. It's not perfect, but it's a lot closer than we have been.
Yeah.
I think we got time for a few more questions if there are any. We got like 5 more minutes, I think. Yes?
Are any of you familiar with traditional Filipino weapons?
Yes. Like Moro Chris's and all that?
Yeah, do you like them?
Yeah. They're alright.
Do you think they're combat ready?
The ones that I have had, yes. I don't know that all of them are. Anyone else here use traditional film?
Right.
See, I'm the weird guy who collects all the weird weapons as well. So I have like the weird Mayan clubs and those type of things. I like stuff.
Let's
But
get a better, more detail on your question. When you say combat ready, yes, they're combat ready for their environment. Are you saying are they combat ready against like a European longsword? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
If that's what you're asking, no. But if for their environment, they're perfect.
yeah.
Because that's, it's who you're going to engage. You know what I mean? Because if it's an island, you're only going to have.
From pure functionality standpoint, I think they're a good company.
Yeah.
I'll get you and then you. So
So for something like the Chris, where it does have the wave form, how would that affect like the dynamics graph or something like
it actually
that?
surprisingly doesn't really.
Okay. I was just
Yeah,
curious.
very, very minimal impact. Everything impacts this, by the way. If you take a sword and do all this measurements perfectly, and then you sharpen it and you retake the measurements, you will have changed something.
And
Any
things like
change to mass.
things like cross section and distal tapers will also affect
Yeah.
that. So if you have a sword that is the same width all the way down, it's going to have different properties than one that tapers near the
Yeah.
point.
But the distribution of mass in a wavy blade is going to be from a rod physics perspective, it's going to be roughly equivalent. How you implement the wave might change it a bit. So you'd have to do all of your dynamic properties after you've gotten the thing in its final format. Or if you're making one, you play with it and you figure it out. And I was just doing all that on the hilt because it's a lot easier to work with than the blade after the fact.
I was wondering, does bronze change the physics of the sword at all?
It will change properties like vibration nodes, I believe, in general. But also in general, because most of this applies to distribution of mass, what really matters is how much mass there is and how much things weigh, right? And so you actually have slightly different weights in terms of volume, by volume from steel to something like bronze.
So, I'm sorry, if they had different vibration nodes, that kind of changed the way that it would have to be used?
It changes where it matters where you hit with, potentially. These are, like, you're asking questions, honestly. There's someone, I said this last time, the other panel, someone could go write a research paper on that one topic. It would be that complex.
To give what I would consider a sort of crapshoot answer, so take this with several grains of salt, you also see slightly different techniques for shaping and making blades in the era when bronze would have been used, and that may have been to basically make up for the intuitive differences in how they would be used.
There's a
There
question
was a
over
question
here.
right
Yep.
there.
What's your favorite non-sword, non-polearm weapon?
Real or fake?
For me,
Lightsaber.
this guy.
See, when you say non-polearm, you just took out like so many weapons.
Oh yeah.
Well, technically, it takes up the mace too.
Yeah, yes it does.
The mace is
I know.
referred to as a polearm, despite being small.
Man, you got me. I don't know. I really love swords. It shows by the fact that the vast majority of my collection is swords. But I'd have to go with some sort of impact weapon like a mace.
It's really good.
In watching some episodes of History Channel's Forged to Fire,
Good show.
they do a lot of Damascus steel.
Yep.
And do you have a preference? Is it just cool looking, or is it also efficient and all the same stuff as the single piece steel would be?
This is a very complex answer you're about to get, to some extent. First of all, I hate the term Damascus steel. Pattern welded or forge welded. Do not call it Damascus. Damascus is, there are people who sell Damascus steel and all it is a pattern that they've etched into it. I like to say pattern welded or forge welded because it describes the process of taking two disparate types of metal, sometimes even the same metal that doesn't show up nearly as well, and twisting them and forming them. You know, katanas are made that way. Viking era swords were made that way, generally speaking. There are benefits to it. There's kind of like a marbling effect. It's like Kobe beef is really good because they marble the fat in there. You marble these kind of two pieces of steel in there, and you can make it potentially a lot better, a lot more resilient, and able to take impacts a lot more. The main reason that existed was actually to remove impurities, and it helped to strengthen that way as well. Modern day Damascus, I think, in my opinion, I think that the benefits of it are minute enough that it doesn't really matter. You can get rolled steel that's just as good these days.
It's just the look mostly.
The look is beautiful, yes, but especially with someone like Forest and Fire, them doing that actually could matter because maybe they're using a slightly rusty thing and they need to get those impurities out, so it could matter. But oh yeah, we got some Damascus right here.
To be exact, these blades are actually for sale. They're $300 a piece. But
They're very pretty.
Yeah. Patterns of Damascus is one of the coolest artistic elements to bladesmithing. He's a really awesome bladesmith. I actually work with him indirectly. His name is Niels Provost. He has made a sword that got some sort of infamy online. He called it the Serpent in the Sword, and then someone made a book called The Serpent in the Sword. But it's a Viking era sword, and he pattern welded in such a way that down the fuller is a serpent. And he was able to do that by like figuring out how to twist this stuff the right way. Really beautiful. He's really talented. He knows very little about swords. Oddly enough, he was just like he's mostly a smith. But really cool stuff, and I think there's an innate value to that. As a sword collector, I think there's a huge value to aesthetics, and swords are as much a piece of art sometimes as they are a tool of destruction, and you kind of balance that in some ways. So I love Damascus. I love pattern welded looks. They're also very expensive.
As tools of arbitration.
Someone's been watching too much Games of Thrones. Games of Thrones.
Yep.
Game of Thrones.
We got it. It's okay.
Oh, it's the end of the
Sunday,
con.
it's
End
late.
of the con. Any other questions? Oh, well, we'll be around to answer some afterwards.
you can be outside around.
Yeah. We're gonna need to get chairs out. We're gonna be shutting down the armory at this point. So I will stand outside to answer questions because I know they gotta get their job together to get all this stuff down. But I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much.